Hello, I'm Marites Vitug, and this is Worldview. We take a look at global, regional, and national affairs in conversations with officials, newsmakers, and analysts. Joining us from Taiwan is Michael Cole, a policy analyst and author of the new book, The Taiwan Tinderbox. We will be talking about what China's planned takeover of Taiwan in 2027 means for us in the region and the world. Michael, welcome to the show. Let's start.
Good afternoon, Marites.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. And let's start, of course, with your origin story. You have been living in Taiwan for 20 years. You're Canadian. You have worked as a journalist, a think tank analyst. So what led you to Taiwan, and how did you develop a great interest in the country?
Well, that's a bit of a long story. I guess what really took me to Taiwan is the 3 years prior to moving to Taiwan, I was working in Ottawa for Canadian government in our intelligence agency. I had been hired soon after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. So obviously, most of the work that we were doing was focused primarily on counterterrorism and all that. But it was also around that time that a lot of people worldwide were starting to ask themselves what the implications of China's rise would be for regional security, for global economy, for human rights, democracy, and all that. So after I discovered that work in government probably was not the best career choice for myself, I decided to regain my freedom, if you will, and to move to the part of the world where I thought that the next big questions would be asked. Needless to say, given my background, I probably could not have gone to China and gotten to work there as a journalist or an analyst. But it certainly made a lot of sense to move to Taiwan, to start a career there as a journalist, and learn how a democracy was trying to defend itself against the attempts by a large neighbor to annex it. And I guess I was fortunate that Taiwan in more recent years has become a major story and now is arguably on the front lines, as I argue in my book, on the front lines of a contest for survival of democracy against authoritarian encroachment and expansionism.
Yes, actually, in your new book, The Taiwan Tinderbox, and I'd like to do some breaking news here, that the Financial Times chose it as one of the best books on politics for 2025. So in your book, you say that the conflict over Taiwan's status is a battle for the future of democracy and something that should concern the international community. Maybe briefly, Michael, if you could walk us through your key arguments in the book.
Well, absolutely. I think one of the first few chapters of my book really take a fairly deep dive in what makes Taiwan an idiosyncratic society and one that is quite distinct from China, notwithstanding what Beijing always says in its propaganda about the shared bloodlines and history and all that. That section of the book is aimed primarily at people around the world who might not know much about what makes Taiwan distinct and why the notion that it could easily be annexed or reunified, as China posits, into the People's Republic of China is a lot more problematic. And certainly in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Taiwan has become one of the hot spots where you have large authoritarian regimes that are using a pretty wide toolkit from gray zone operations to influence operations and ultimately military means to try to rewrite the maps that were drawn following World War II and to expand in ways that would further their own revisionist interests. And Taiwan is front and center as a modern democracy that also serves as an example, on the one hand, of a country that is proximate to China, has some cultural linguistic affinities with China, certainly deals quite heavily in terms of investment and business with China, but on the other hand, also is striving to maintain, to protect, to defend its identity and way of life in a way that does not turn that society into what it does not want to be. So it's the constant challenge of retaining your democratic principles in ways that do not undermine those principles as you face an external challenge by a much larger opponent.
Yeah, it's also, well, this deadline that supposedly President Xi Jinping set is 2027 for a possible takeover of Taiwan. Is it accurate to say that that's a deadline for Beijing to take over Taiwan, or is it, some were saying it's merely a deadline for the People's Liberation Army to step up its capability? Yeah, you said in your book that it's not a likely scenario anyway for China to do this in 2027.
Right. Well, this is a misreading that we've been seeing in the media and some government circles in recent years. What was actually said by Xi Jinping is that he has ordered the PLA to have sufficient capabilities by 2027 so that if called upon, the PLA could use force against Taiwan. But unfortunately, in recent years, we've seen a number of analysts claim that this is a deadline that was set by Xi Jinping, and that before that, China would actually use force against Taiwan to achieve its political objectives. So this is certainly not based on what we've been seeing. A clear signal, and I really doubt that Beijing would actually project its intentions in such a transparent way. It would be putting itself in a corner if, for different reasons, they were not able to develop the capabilities or to train sufficiently so that they could, with confidence, decide to use force against Taiwan. So this is very much about developing capabilities. And what we've seen more recently with the number of senior PLA officers and generals who were removed from their positions by Xi Jinping as part of an ongoing anti-corruption campaign is that most of the experienced officers in the PLA are no longer in positions of authority or no longer within the armed forces. So that if the PLA were asked today to take action against Taiwan, all that experience has been lost. Corruption also has had an impact on the purchasing of weapon systems by the PLA and all that. So there's a series of recent developments over the years that very likely undermined the Chinese military's ability to have met that deadline by 2027, to at least have the capabilities and means to take action against Taiwan.
And you also say, anyway, that an outright invasion is very risky. And you said there are two other options. Maybe you can explain to us the difference between a naval air blockade and a quarantine, because these are the two other options that are being discussed as possible scenarios for China's takeover of Taiwan.
Yeah, well, in a incremental fashion, a quarantine would be a smaller endeavor than an outright blockade. So quarantine would conceivably rely more on the Chinese Coast Guard, which is not a civilian Coast Guard in the way that we understand it in most democracies. Ultimately, in the chain of command, the Chinese Coast Guard falls under the Chinese military. So in that regard, it is more a paramilitary capability than just a Coast Guard civilian law enforcement agency. But anyway, in a quarantine scenario, you would see a first attempt to undermine traffic around Taiwan and trade with Taiwan as a coercive means to compel the Taiwanese authorities to sit down and negotiate some sort of surrender with the Chinese government, which inevitably would be on Beijing's terms as well. Then if you go up the escalation ladder, then you would have a full naval blockade that would call upon Chinese military capabilities, so naval forces, air force, possibly submarines and other aspects of Chinese military in combination with their Coast Guard and maritime militia. to fully isolate Taiwan from the international community, to try to choke its ability to import energy sources that Taiwan is heavily reliant upon for its continued operations and survival, blockade of foodstuffs and all that, so that it is hoped that after several weeks or a matter of a few months, the Taiwanese government again would have no choice but to negotiate surrender on Chinese terms. So these are two likelier scenarios, if you will, still a formidable ask for the Chinese military, because I also argue in the book that you cannot prosecute a quarantine or a blockade against Taiwan in a vacuum. That would inevitably have consequences on major regional economies, so certainly but Philippines, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and pretty much the rest of the world as well. So the notion that Beijing would be able to launch a blockade against Taiwan without some sort of response by the international community is certainly very hard to imagine.
And also with the economy of China slowing down, I think you also mentioned that China is not in a strong position to consider a blockade or an outright invasion. Is the economy a key argument? Is the Chinese economy a key argument against doing any of this?
Well, that's always a tricky question, because once you raise the issue of the economy and the potential damage that you could cause by launching some sort of military operation against Taiwan, there's also always the assumption that we're dealing with under what we call the rational actor model. So a leadership that thinks along the rational lines of costs versus benefits. And in that regard, the belief that the Chinese leadership would not do anything that would unduly put at risk the Chinese economy and the quality of the Chinese economy. So in that regard, again, assuming rational decision making in Beijing, it's difficult to imagine that the leadership would launch a kind of operation, what with all the uncertainty that surrounds military operations and how the international community would react, with total disregard for the potential impact on the Chinese economy and the welfare of the Chinese people. So this is among the variables that we assume act as a deterrent against that kind of harsh action on the part of the Chinese regime. Now, the big challenge that we're all facing is that nobody's in Xi Jinping's head. He is an ultra-personalistic authoritarian leader. So oftentimes with that type of leadership, the leader does not listen to or take into account the advice of his experts on a particular subject. And in this discussion today, that subject is most certainly Taiwan. So a leader that does not have all the information at hand, who probably believes he knows best, could also potentially take decisions that ultimately go against the interest of the state that he represents. We certainly saw that with Vladimir Putin with the decision to invade Ukraine in 2022. It is said that most of his close advisors were warning him that a quick victory in Ukraine, occupation of Kiev within a matter of days, was highly unlikely, and that they would get bogged down for a number of months, if not years, as it turned out. But Vladimir Putin, given his own authoritarian inclinations, simply did not listen to that advice and did indeed launch a war that ultimately proved catastrophic for the Russian economy. That is not to say that if Vladimir Putin made that decision, that Xi Jinping would also do the unthinkable. But this is nonetheless the kind of scenario that if you're in Taiwan's position, you cannot afford to not make preparations against a possible scenario of that nature.
Yes, I was going to that. The preparations that Taiwan is doing, you mentioned in your book, they're into asymmetric warfare planning, they're producing their own drones, and I think many more. Maybe can you explain to us maybe the mood there and how are these preparations, building up towards, any of these scenarios?
Well, Taiwan has been living under the threat of Chinese military action of some sort for several decades. Now we are approaching the period where the Chinese regime might be able to combine intent and capabilities and therefore be able or willing to act upon the threat that has existed for over several years. It remained a mostly abstract threat for most people living here in Taiwan because you hear bluster and threat of war for decades and nothing really happens. But certainly developments in Europe, particularly in Ukraine since 2022, have focused minds in Taiwan. Certainly the elite and leadership realize that the unthinkable is once again a possibility. And that large-scale warfare of a type that we possibly saw during World War II is once again a reality that smaller countries need to conjugate with and prepare against. So we have seen greater will on the part of recent governments in Taiwan to make the kinds of investments and shifts and changes in military doctrine that are necessary to continuing and augmenting deterrence against a Chinese military action against Taiwan. In some areas that involve continuing arms procurement from United States, types of weaponry that are highly effective in these kinds of scenarios, and scenarios that Taiwan has been preparing for a number of years. We've also seen greater emphasis on indigenous production of weapon systems, so land attack cruise missiles, as you mentioned, drone systems, which are now a prominent aspect of modern warfare, as we're seeing in places like Ukraine today. And also a doctrinal shift moving away from a more passive approach to national defense, whereby in the past the Taiwanese military would wait for PLA forces to approach Taiwan and cross the median line in the Taiwan Strait before they start taking action against those. Now, in the past, I would argue 5 or 6 years, with a green light, quite possibly from the United States, the Taiwanese military has moved towards what we call a counterforce posture, which means that you have the capabilities and the intent to strike targets in China, so naval bases, air bases, and whatnot, radar sites, before those forces can even cross the median line in the Taiwan Strait, which would further complicate China's ability and the PLA's ability to conduct and to sustain military operations against Taiwan. So this is a major change. And as I said, realizing the shifting nature of the threat and how the PLA has continued to modernize and invest heavily in capabilities that conceivably would play a role in the Taiwan contingency. We've seen a number of American administrations now show greater willingness for Taiwan to acquire, develop, and deploy these types of more offensive capabilities within the Taiwanese military.
So even under Trump, there is still that commitment from the U.S. to supply them with weapons and arms?
This is the stated policy of the United States under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. And in that act, there is flexibility in the language that basically says the scope and nature of arms transfers to Taiwan are based upon the nature and scope of the threat against it by the PLA. As we have seen in recent years, the threat has continued to grow. Therefore, series of American administrations, this has been reflected in the arms sales and technological transfers, as well as other forms of support to Taiwan, also all meant to address the growing threat against Taiwan by the PLA.
So for Taiwan, the deterrence is key in preventing the conflict. How about other friendly countries? What can be done? Because we all don't want, of course, to see war, but what can be done to prevent this conflict?
Yeah, this is essential as well. And the more regional countries in the international community realize that it is in their own interest for war to be avoided in the Taiwan Strait, the more they can do to, in the aggregate, create a deterrent against a military adventurism by China. So there's different levels. Obviously, a handful of countries within the region, which United States military in the lead. And here I'm talking primarily about countries like Japan, which is a neighbor of Taiwan, but certainly the Philippines as well. They can also bring their own military capabilities to bear, so that which the statements that suggest that they would also play a role in a Taiwan Strait contingency. This will then make leadership in Beijing think twice about embarking upon that kind of adventure in the Taiwan Strait, because the more they are convinced that they would not only face an isolated Taiwan, but that they would face a constellation of countries, the more complicated it would be for them to achieve their objectives militarily. So that's on the military front, but there's certainly political, economic as well aspects to deterrence that the international community can certainly bring to bear as a means to affect Chinese calculations. If there is a signal that you would face a concert of nations would also impose sanctions or limit transfers of key technologies that the Chinese government needs to fuel its own economy, should China decide to threaten Taiwan or take action against Taiwan. These are all things that would also contribute to deterring against a Chinese attack by the Chinese government. There's also, at the political level, there's a series of things that countries can do through statements, through engagement. The more you have international companies investing in Taiwan, the more complicated it is for China to also wage war against Taiwan, given the fact that that would expand the costs for a whole set of different countries as well. So the more you incorporate Taiwan into the global economy and community of nations, the more difficult it would be for China to argue that this is an internal matter, which is what Chinese propaganda wants the rest of the world to believe. And B, the more difficult it would be to treat that conflict in isolation, because there would be so many other interests from other countries and multinationals that they would also very likely take action against China should it decide to take that extra step and use force against Taiwan.
Yes, apart from the military preparations of Taiwan, just wanted to go back, there's also a strong civilian defense preparations. It's not just the armed forces that are preparing, but I think you wrote about, the population, the civilians being prepared for a potential conflict. How is this done? I mean, how do you prepare residents, civilians for this scenario?
Well, these are also lessons that we're learning from current situation in Europe. Following the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014, there was a realization among many Ukrainians that they had been unprepared for that kind of scenario. They were wrong-footed, and Russia was able to get away with what it wanted, or at least partly with what it wanted, at a relatively low cost. And this was all hybrid warfare, gray zone operations and whatnot. So certainly Baltic countries across Europe, and now countries like Taiwan are realizing that the nature of warfare has been changing, and that the ways by which countries now win wars is not solely on military lines, but there's a whole spectrum of other agencies that are at play. And to counter those, society needs to call upon civilians as well to build up resilience and to play a role in different scenarios. Countries like Taiwan, certainly, and that's something that Taiwan has in common with Philippines, there oftentimes are natural catastrophes, whether it's earthquakes or typhoons and landslides and flooding. So Taiwanese society is already aware of the need for society to come together and work to address humanitarian catastrophes and situations and whatnot. Well, to that now there is a realization that with a growing threat of war, that civilians must also learn certain skills to play a role in countering a potential attack by China, but also to have the necessary training and access to certain materials so that if they are called upon, if they are activated, they know what to do and they know who to turn to. So this is a whole exercise where you have civic organizations working in conjunction with government agencies in Taiwan to sensitize the public to that reality and provide the necessary training. This is all relatively new. This is something that Taiwan has not been doing. But fortunately, it has allies around the world where there is substantial experience doing these kinds of activities. And Taiwan has been open to learning from them as well. So we've seen several exchanges in recent years, delegations going to and coming from countries that have long traditions of doing that, of trusting civilians to play a role in national defense, and trying to apply those lessons in Taiwan so that they are better prepared to deal with these different scenarios as well.
Yeah, Michael, for the last question, which is closer to home, the Philippines is geographically very close to Taiwan, and our president, Marcos, said that because of this, we will be dragged into the conflict. And the U.S. military has access to Philippine bases called EDCA sites, some located in provinces near Taiwan. Do you see these EDCA sites taking on an important role in case of conflict in the Taiwan Strait? And now I'd like you to show your book after you answer this question.
Certainly. Well, again, given the Philippines' proximity to Taiwan, inevitably, if there were to be armed conflict in the Taiwan Strait or around Taiwan, there would be an impact for the Philippines. Not to mention the large number of Philippine nationals who live in Taiwan as well. So, the Philippine government would probably do its utmost to evacuate its citizens as well. So, they would get dragged into that conflict, whether they want to or not. And certainly, given the Philippines' also long history of dealing with Chinese gray zone operations, with Chinese claims upon large sections of the Philippine Sea or the South China Sea, as the Chinese call it, we're seeing in recent years the realization that it's also in the Philippines' interest to possibly work more closely with Taiwan. And Taiwan also is trying to learn certain lessons from how the Philippines has been addressing the Chinese challenge in their own backyard. And we've seen involvement by countries like the United States and certainly Japan as well, that are all committed to maintaining the status quo and peace and stability in that region. So having stated that the Philippines has a stake in maintaining stability and avoiding war in the Taiwan Strait, that goes back to the earlier point on deterrence as well and what other countries can do. If the Philippines, in this case, oftentimes in conjunction with the American military, can complicate Chinese calculations by having capabilities in northern parts of Philippines, that could be activated to counter Chinese operations, especially if they try to cross the Bashi Channel and then continue on to the West Pacific to attack Taiwan from behind. If you can close off that corridor for the PLA Navy and Air Force, again, that would make decision makers in Beijing realize that the thought of waging war against Taiwan and that they would be able to do that easily and to resolve that in a matter of days or weeks is probably confabulation, because you would see activity by other countries as well. So this is again, I think that's a key example of a country that because of its geographical location has a role to play or would conceivably play a role in deterring a Chinese attack. And if indeed there is military action, then they have capabilities as well to play a role in countering Chinese invasion of Taiwan and reducing the likelihood that it would be a successful operation.
Now, can we show your book? And Michael, tell us that it has been released in Europe. And it has an America. It will be released in the U.S. today, right, or in the next few days. Maybe you can tell us more about where we can access, you can get your book.
Yes, indeed. Well, the book came out in the UK. The publisher is British. It's Polity Press. It came out in October in the UK. It is now finally available in the US market as of today or tomorrow, November 26th, and around the same time as well across Europe. So most major most major booksellers as well as Amazon and other platforms all carry the book as of today.
Thank you so much, Michael. This is a very illuminating interview, and congratulations on your new book. Thank you to our viewers. To continue this conversation, download the Rappler app and join our chat channels. That's it for today's show. This has been Marites Vitug on Worldview. Till next time.